Hello, hi, welcome to Eclectic Symmetry. My name's Caleb, and this is yet another episode in my Visualizing the Fretboard through Basic Musical Math guitar class series. In this episode, I'll be teaching the 7 different types of barred chords on guitar. So we're just going to jump into it with the very first being the most common barred chord that pretty much everybody recognizes, which is a full barred chord. For the standard groups of starting chords you're taught on guitar, that's going to be things like your F and your B. Now, it's not vital to learn barred chords. You can still play fantastic songs all along the fretboard without ever learning barred chords. You take Sting's Shape of My Heart, for example. And that pretty much runs the fretboard. Fun fact, that's largely played with triads and modes and scales. Anyway, it's still valuable to learn barred chords and full barred chords, and I definitely recommend them because it gives you options to translate chords up and down the fretboard. So that's the first that I'm going to teach, but it's actually the 4th easiest chord to play on guitar. So next I'm going to teach the 3rd easiest, then the 2nd easiest, and then the easiest, and then move into the more obscure and difficult barred chords after that. But yeah, if you're new to guitar, it's going to hurt to learn to play barred chords, specifically when you're starting, for 3 different reasons. First, you're still developing calluses on the tips of your chord hand. The tips of your fingers. Second, you're exercising muscles in your arm and wrist that you may not be used to exercising, to stretching. So it takes time for those to strengthen. And last, you're likely still conditioning the palm of your hand, depending on what you do for a living. Most barred chords are largely played with the index finger being the barred point. There are different types, and I'll get into that in a minute, but the reason for that being is because of where you hold that barred chord. Anything to my right towards the machine heads from that barred chord is going to be muffled. It won't change the sound of the chord at all playing beyond that point, because essentially what changes the key that you're in when you're playing a string, the gear heads create the tension. You fine-tune that tension to whatever key you want it to be in, and where you place your fingers on a fret, it changes that tension point between where it's anchored at the bridge and where you've created that new tension. So anything beyond that point and you can't hear it. Now, it's useful playing stuff like that on guitar for hammer-ons and pull-offs, but that's a different lesson. For full barred chords, there's really no reason to play towards the machine heads. So that's the first reason why the index finger, the main reason why it's usually used for barred chords to anchor that. You get what I mean. But a little trick mi padre taught me early on to help with the developing calluses on the tips of my fingers to keep those strong is to bite the skin on the tips of my fingers. So if you notice people biting their fingernails out in public, they may not be indeed biting their fingernails. They may just be a strings player, whether it's bass, guitar, viola, or what have you. But yeah, if you're struggling to get quality out of a barred chord, a full barred chord, for one, just know as you stretch the muscles in your hand, it'll get easier over time the more you do it. But some of the things that beginners struggle with creating a proper pressure is putting too much tension on it. Something that helps me get the proper pressure, I like to think about the muscles in my hand between my thumb and my index finger as kind of like a spring clamp. You know, you open up both sides and you allow the tension, the pressure in that spring to be what holds that pressure down. As opposed to a vice clamp, a crank clamp, where you're just making it tighter and tighter and tighter. That's not going to help get that clarity out of a barred chord, and in fact it'll hurt your hand to play over time. Some of the reasons you may be struggling to get quality sound is one, placement. So if you place it on the top of the fret marker, it's going to muffle it and it won't sound clear. I mean, if you're trying to play like a bossa nova, for example, that kind of muffled sound may be desirable, but largely you're looking for a full clarity so you can strum better along with it. Now, placement is what may be helping or hurting getting that clarity. You want to place it somewhat in the middle of the two fret markers. If you're struggling to get clarity there, you can move a little bit closer to the edge of the fret markers. So it basically allows a greater tension when you're pressing down because it's closer to that fret marker, if that makes sense. Another reason beginners struggle to get quality sound out of barred chords, and this happens a lot with beginner chords in general, is stretching strings in ways they may not intend to, trying to get that proper pressure. This can happen with barred chords, the most common culprit being the high E string being stretched beyond the edge of the fret marker. That's gonna, when you're playing a barred chord, trying to get too much pressure. That's part of what gives that sloppy sound. It's not about stretching the strings, you want to push it down, and again, it's a spring clamp. So yeah, as you condition your hand more and the muscles in your arm get stronger, it will become easier to do this over time. That said, it's not equally easy to play full barred chords across all guitar types. You take a classical, for example, those can be much bigger and have wider necks, so it's more of a strain to play a full barred chord. Different techniques, you can try holding it up like a stand-up bass. I find that's easier to stretch these crazy frets, like 7 frets apart. Or I could just slide it further down the fretboard where the frets are smaller and get that much easier. But again, that's a different lesson. Point being, the more you practice this over time, the easier it gets, and it's not equally easy across all guitars. But moving on, that's the first on our list, but it's the 4th easiest type of barred chord to play on guitar. The 2nd easiest is your partial barred chord. So there are 2 different variations of the partial barred chord, and one's more difficult than the other. You have a flex barred chord, and that's the more difficult version. You take a standard A major, for example. You can play it just by using a partial barred chord. If you're new, I recommend to play it with either these 3 fingers or these 3 fingers in sequence. But the reason why playing an A major is difficult is because for it to be a proper A major, you want to keep that high E string unchanged. So essentially I need to be flexing my finger so I'm not changing that high E string. I'm leaving it open. It's still an A chord holding down that string. It's just in this case in A major 6. But that's a lesson for a separate video. If you're interested in what's going on there, check out my video on building chords through numbers. Just a full partial barred chord without that flex is the 3rd easiest type of chord to play on guitar. And that's essentially just not flexing it, allowing it to hold down. So these are typically going to be played between 4, 3, and 2 strings. You can play it between 5 strings. Between 3, 2, and 4 strings, there's not going to be too much of a pressure difference as far as holding it down enough to get quality sound out of it. Moving on to 5, I feel a little bit of more tension in my index finger and my palm down here, holding that down. So it's a little more difficult, but not as difficult as a full 5. Another thing that beginners may struggle with getting the quality sound out of barred chords in general is thumb placement on the back of the guitar. You know, I kind of keep my thumb kind of like that. So it's just kind of resting out. But that changes depending on what types of chord that you're playing. But again, that's a separate video. So thumb pressure is important between these. Again, 2, 3, 4 strings, they don't feel much different. It changes a little bit with the 5th string. But that's the third easiest type of barred chord playing guitar, the partial barred chord. The second easiest is your pinky barred chord. Now in theory you can play barred chords with any finger on your hand. It's just easier or more difficult depending on different types of whatever finger you're using. Pinky, typically that's going to be between 3 to 2 strings. You can do 4 strings, but because the pinky is on the right side of your hand, my hand, on my left hand in this case, and to simplify it, if you're left-handed, basically from where my index finger is, the pinky is closer to the bridge. Again, establishing this is a mute point, so anything beyond this is mutes, a moot point. But with the pinky, because that's all the fingers beyond that are closer to the machine heads. If I'm playing 4 or 5 strings with a pinky partial bar mute, that limits my options for chords I can build up here with my other fingers. I'd have to stretch over the my pinky, and that doesn't really make sense. That's overly complicated, like a tongue twister, and you're not going to be able to access a lot of chords quickly that way in songs. But for that reason, typically it's going to be between a 3 and a 2 fret partial bar. And I'm just messing around with the chords as I'm talking there, but you get what I mean. So that's the second easiest type of barred chord to play in guitar, largely being because it's between 2 to 3 strings as far as its usability. You're closing off your options the more strings you bar with that. The easiest chord to play barred chord to play in guitar is a partial muted barred chord, because you can be lazy about it. This is going to be more useful if you're playing a chord that's going to be dissonant in one spot. You may not like the tension in that chord. You still like the essence of the 7th chord, meaning the 4 notes in between it, but you don't like those open strings because in that spot it just sounds tense. So that's a case where you could use a partial barred muted chord. And essentially what's going on here is where I have the callus on my index finger holding the anchor point for that, that partial bar. Instead of holding it down enough to get that sound, I'm just allowing it to be lazy and rest there. I'm allowing the skin on my index finger to mute it. And I'm only holding the top of it down enough to get that, the clarity out of that. I could just take that out of it and turn the chord into a triad, meaning it's only got 3 notes instead of 4. And it's all essentially the same thing, more or less. So that's the reason why I consider that to be the easiest type of barred chord you can play on guitar, because you can be lazy about it and still get the effect you may be looking for. So, moving on into the more obscure and difficult chords. The 5th easiest barred chord to play on guitar is the arched barred chord. Now let me know in the comments below if this is actually called something different in music. This is just a type of barred chord I discovered just messing around, so that's what I'm calling it because that's what makes sense to me. So an arched barred chord is somewhat similar, it's in a similar vein to the flexed partial bar. Remember with the A major, to keep it a true A major, I'm having a flex. But an arched barred chord is only holding down 2 notes with my index finger. So that essentially, the value of that is I can allow 1 string in between, or however many strings I want in between those 2. strings that I'm changing, in this case the A string and the E string, I can allow all three strings between, so the D, G, and B to all not be affected, or I can just change one or two. So that's an arched barred chord. Now a little thing to note with this, I'm flexing my finger, my index finger. It's difficult not to accidentally have the skin on the palm of my index finger accidentally mute that B string. What helps me get clarity out of it is not only being closer to the edge of the fret marker with my skin down there, but also being closer to the edge of the wood on the neck. So essentially, as opposed to accidentally muting it. So it's all about that arch, getting that arch properly if you want to get clarity out of that B string. And for that reason, I usually choose to intentionally allow that B string to be muted, to allow that to be okay, because it takes more work to access that clarity, or I'll hold that B string down beyond that mute point and add that as a part of the chord. But yeah, that's an arched barred chord. You can play it between both E strings, both the A and the E, the D and the G. It becomes a little more difficult getting closer to the G and the high E because there's more of an extreme arch in my index finger as I'm playing that. So trying to just hold those two down while holding the keeping the B in the middle clear is difficult. There's really no reason to try to do it with the B and the E. At that point, you may as well just bar both, or allow one to be muted, whatever your choice. Use a partial barred chord for two strings. But yeah, that's the fifth easiest type of barred chord to play on guitar, one of the more difficult versions. The sixth easiest is your thumb bar. Now, barring with your thumb changes your grip, because with most bar chords back here, your thumb can rest on the back of the neck, but with a thumb bar, you have to wrap it all the way around and over the top. There's really no reason to try to hold down all 6 strings to a full thumb bar, because that limits your options for different chord types you can play up here. I mean, yeah, if you want to mess around with that, I'm sure you can do stuff with it, but it's difficult the further your thumb moves down the neck. Yeah, you get what I mean. But typically these are going to be between 2 to 3 frets, 2 being easier. But again, the further down your thumb moves, the more your hand has to change in response. It can't just rest on the back. So that's a thumb barred chord. I have a variation of this in a song that I wrote. But that's just a single thumb bar, as it were, so it's not technically a barred chord, it's just changing one string. But yeah, that's one of the more difficult types of barred chords to play out there. The 7th easiest, so the most difficult type of barred chord to play on guitar, is a multi-fret arched barred chord. So you can actually play these across 2 to 3 frets. So if you notice my index finger, holding down the A string's 5th fret, but I'm also holding down the high E string's 3rd fret with the palm of my hand there. You can get some interesting chords out of it. One thing to note, the further the bottom of my palm moves down or closer to the machine heads, it changes the position where I'm anchoring it. So with a normal arched barred chord, it's about there. When I move 2 frets apart, it's a little more on the side here to get that stretch. And when I'm 3 frets apart, it's closer down on my palm here to get that. Now, depending on how big your hands are, you could go up to 4 frets in theory, or again, you could just slide up past the 12th fret and that'll become easier to access per se. It's still a very difficult chord to play and especially get clarity out of. But yeah, that's one of the most difficult types of barred chords to play on guitar. It's really somewhat interchangeable with the thumb barred chord. They're both pretty difficult. But yeah, if you stuck around this long, thanks for watching. And a quick little bonus, an 8th type of barred chord per se. I mean, it's not a true barred chord. It is somewhat in the category in that you're using a single finger or multiple fingers to affect more than just one string. And you hear a lot of these type of chords in music in general, and it's a split string mute, which is essentially where you're using fingers to mute two strings, individual strings or more, next to each other. So again, moving back up to that concept of finding a point where we have a dissonance in the sound that we may not like. We like the sound in between, but we don't like both those high E's. So we can mute those and just close off that kind of overtone that we may not be liking. And that dissonance is not a true overtone, but you get what I mean. So I'm muting these both E strings in different ways. For the top one, I'm using my middle finger to allow the from where I'm anchoring on the A string, I allow the skin on my index finger to mute the one next to it, the E string. So I can hear the A string where I'm holding it down. In this case, it's an E, but whatever. I want to mute that overarching E, you know. And for the high E string on the bottom, again, I'm just using the palm of my index finger to mute it. Now, you can mute pretty much any string in any chord type that you want. So let's say I don't like, yeah, in this case I definitely don't really dig that, the D string in there. So I want to mute that. I may like the chord, but I don't want that D note in there. But yeah, you get what I mean. With the strings in between, you gotta mute them in different ways. You can use pretty much any finger to find a way to mute a note that you may not be looking for in that chord. You hear this a lot in music, you may not realize it, but muting individual notes happens a lot. But anyway, if you like this kind of content, this has been Caleb with Eclectic Symmetry. Thanks for watching, and keep an eye out for my video on building chords through numbers.